Welcome to Sarah, the true hero of the Akeda. I'm Dr. Moshe Shoshan of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, Bar-Ilan University. The story of the Akeda, the binding of Isaac, is of course one of the most famous stories in the entire Tanakh, and really one of the most famous stories in the entire Western religious and literary tradition. It's also one of the formative stories of Judaism. We read the story on Rosh Hashanah, and we ask God to remember the total commitment of Abraham and Yitzchak when judging us, his descendants, on Rosh Hashanah. But it's also a story about a family, about a father and a son, and about their complex relationship with each other. But there's someone who's absent from this story. The mother and wife, Sarah. She's deeply connected to Yitzchak through the entire story, the many chapters beforehand, waiting for his birth, protecting him. So the fact that we don't hear anything about her in this story is actually really quite striking. Did she know what was going on? Did she ever find out what happened? How did she respond? How did she feel? What did she think? Torah is totally silent about all of this. It doesn't tell us anything. But the rabbis of the Midrash were actually quite sensitive to this silence. They asked these very questions, and they looked back to the biblical texts for answers. In this lecture, we're going to trace the history of the Midrashim, which actually find Sarah's voice and her perspective in the Akeda. How, based on a close reading of a single part of the text, of the biblical text, they connect Sarah to the Akeda, and eventually she becomes a central figure in the Akeda and in the entire, and transforming not only the Akeda, but the entire Rosh Hashanah and the mitzvah of the shofar. But then this new story, this radical new story, raises problems of its own, theological issues of its own. And still later Midrashim have to go back to this earlier Midrash and transform it once again, tweaking it and changing it to deal with these theological problems. In the process, also marginalizing Sarah's position in the story. So the first question is, if Sarah doesn't appear in the Akeda, so if she's not in the text at all, so where are the rabbis going to find her? Well, it turns out that she doesn't appear in Perek Kaf Bet, in chapter 22 of the Akeda, but the very next chapter, she most certainly does appear. We read, "Vayu chayei Sarah me'ah shana v'eshrim shana v'sheva shanim, shnei chayei Sarah. V'tamat Sarah b'kiryat Arba, hi Chevron, v'eretz Canaan, v'yavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livchota." Right? Sarah lives for 127 years, we're told, and then she dies in Kiryat Arba, which is Chevron, and Avraham comes, or as the translation says, he proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So that's the text, and we see that, in fact, in the next chapter, she has a central role. She dies, major event in her life, and the rest of the chapter is Avraham's response to that, to her death, and how he finds for her grave. So what does the Midrash do with all of this? Bereshit Rabbah, which is the earliest Midrash we have that's focused on Sefer Bereshit, on the book of Genesis, says as follows: "Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah, mehechan ba." Midrash asks the following question. It says, "Vayavo Avraham lispod." Avraham came to mourn her. What does it mean to come to mourn? Why doesn't it just say that Avraham mourned her? What does this extra word vayavo come to teach us? It sounds like he came from somewhere. Now, the simple pshat of the text is that this is an idiom. This is just the way the Bible speaks. Vayavo lispod is a way of saying, as the translation said before, he proceeded to mourn. This is normal biblical style. It seems to be the simplest understanding of the text. But the Midrash is never happy with the simplest reading of the text. The Midrash is interested in the most interesting reading of the text. Simple grammatical or stylistic explanations don't cut it for the Midrash. So they say, well, if Avraham came from somewhere, Vayavo Avraham, he must have come from somewhere. Well, where was he last? So like detectives, they go back in the text and look for the last place Avraham was. And the previous chapter, as we said, was the Akeda. So they say, Mehechan ba, Mehara Moriah. Where did he come? He came straight from Mount Moriah, from the Temple Mount, and he came straight there, home, to mourn for Sarah. Now, this clearly isn't shot in the Psukim. In the story of the Akeda, Avraham comes home to Beersheba. After that, we hear a very short little account of him getting the news of the birth of Rivka. And only then, in the next chapter, do we hear about the death of Sarah. So the death of Sarah, which happens, it seems, in Hebron. So it seems that they weren't even living, they've moved in between. And while Sarah's death happens after the Akeda, we don't know how much long after the Akeda. It seems like it could have been many years. But the Midrash, through this reading of Vayavo, and he came, says no. The two events came one right after the other. They are chronologically linked. So now we finally have a connection between Sarah and her death and the Akeda. But still, there's no real connection. It's a different story. She died, but it isn't a result of anything that happens in the Akeda. It's just a question of the timing. So the Midrash now creates an elementary link between Sarah and her death and the Akeda. Okay, but what happens next? Now we turn to Vayikra Rabbah. Vayikra Rabbah is a Midrash which is from around the same time as Bereshit Rabbah. It may have been somewhat later, but certainly this Midrash, this particular passage, seems to be responding to the earlier, much simpler Midrash that we saw in Bereshit Rabbah. And Vayikra Rabbah retells the entire story of the Akeda in its own words. And here's how it ends. Shekevan shechazar Yitzchak etzel imo, va'amra lo, an haveit b'ri. When Yitzchak came home, his mother said to him, "Where have you been, my son?" Amar la, nitalani abba v'heleni harim v'oridani gvaot v'chule. So he starts telling her. He tells him the entire story. Father took me up mountains and down valleys, and eventually we got to Har Moriah, and the entire Akeda happened. He tells her the whole story. What's her response? Vai al bra derefta ilule hamalach tvar hayita shachut. She says, wait a minute. Are you telling me that the angel didn't come down at the very last minute and tell your father not to kill you? He would have killed you? My husband would have killed you, my son, and you'd be dead? Amarle, yeah. He says, yeah, sure. So at that very moment, the moment that he hears that, in fact, her husband was ready to kill her son, she cries out 6 cries, woes, which the Midrash says is parallel to the 6 tkiyot that we blow over the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. In those days, they blew a lot less tkiyot. Lo hispika ligmor et hadavar ad shemeta. She had scarcely finished speaking when she died. The entire story of the Akeda is now completely different. The story in the Bible is a story of the binding of Isaac. It's an almost sacrifice. But in the end, everyone goes home safe and sound without a scratch. Nothing ultimately happens. It's only a test. And even though this might have been a terrifying and traumatic experience for Abraham and certainly for Yitzchak, the Torah doesn't tell anything about this. It doesn't really tell us what they're thinking or feeling. And the text could be read, and it has been read, as saying that they didn't really have any problem with this. They were ready, willing, and able, and they weren't traumatized by this at all. When God canceled it, they were like, okay, good. So the story ultimately has a happy ending. But now, in the Midrash's retelling, the stakes are much higher because someone actually dies as a result of the Akeda. And someone actually suffers emotionally, terribly. And that person is Sarah. So now Sarah's death is the apex of the entire story. It's the ultimate crisis is her death that results from these events. But the Midrash doesn't just transform the story of the Akeda. It links the story, this transformation of the story of the Akeda to the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And by saying that in blowing the shofar, we remember her cries, it says that not only that we don't blow the shofar because we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah to remember the ram which Avraham sacrificed in the place of Yitzchak, to remember Yitzchak's great sacrifice and Avraham's great sacrifice, and to ask God to remember that when he judges us. Rather, we blow it to remember Sarah's suffering and Sarah's death. So now, that's what we want God to remember on Rosh Hashanah. That's the ultimate sacrifice that we want, that makes the Akeda the Akeda. So Sarah has now been placed at the center of the Akeda and at the center of the entire holiday of Rosh Hashanah. But in doing this, the Midrash teaches a pretty deep lesson in bringing this female perspective on the Akeda. Because what the story is saying is that Sarah is the true hero of the Akeda. And that maybe perhaps in general, the real heroes in history, in Judaism, are not the men who go off on great adventures in the name of great causes, sometimes risking their lives, even going to war. They're not the real heroes. The heroes are the mothers and the wives who stay behind, who weren't even necessarily consulted about the men going off to fight or going off to engage in these great causes for God. But they stay home anyways, and they worry. And they're concerned about the men who go off. And they suffer, and sometimes they even die from this. And what the Midrash is saying is these women, these wives and mothers, this is the true hero of the Akeda. Maybe these are the true heroes of Jewish history and of Judaism. So we now have a radical new interpretation, not only perhaps of the Akeda and Rosh Hashanah, but perhaps our entire perspective on religious devotion and on Jewish history might now be transformed to see it from the women's point of view. It takes the women who are staying home and places them in the center, and their suffering and their concerns places that in the center. So this is a radical transformation of the Akeda, which the Midrash creates or accomplishes by finding Sarah's place and Sarah's perspective in the Akeda and placing that at the center of the story. But this transformation has other consequences. The story of the Akeda was, from the beginning, from the earliest interpretations, was seen as a story that raises the question of theodicy, of why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God not only allow this to happen to Avraham and Yitzchak, but actually causes it and commands it to happen to Avraham and Yitzchak? How can we justify this? And as a result, from the earliest times, Avraham is associated with Eov, with Job, who is the paradigm in Tanakh of the righteous one who suffers despite the fact that he has not sinned. But despite the fact that the Akeda in and of itself, without these midrashim, can be seen as raising this deep problem of why the righteous suffer, ultimately, again, the problem isn't so severe because ultimately in the Akeda, no one gets hurt and there's no explicit account of any psychic suffering. So the problem's there and various interpreters try to deal with it, but at the same time, it's not the absolute worst possible occasion of the righteous suffering. And it certainly isn't Job, who actually loses everything. But now, in the Midrash's version, and it's important to note that when Vayikra Rabbah retells the entire story of the Akeda, it tells it in the context of its interpretation of the story of the death of Aaron's sons, and in a discussion of precisely this, of righteous people who suffer terribly and people who lose their children. So once we say this, once we put Sarah's death and we say that Sarah suffered and died as part of the Akeda, the whole problem of why do the righteous suffer becomes infinitely worse. Because now someone really died, suffered and died as a result of the Akeda. God set into motion this process, these events, and the result, which could have been perhaps foreseen from the beginning, is that Sarah dies. So now we have a much bigger question. How could God do this? How could God set into motion these events which caused Sarah to suffer and die? And the later rabbis, after this midrash was formulated, who read this midrash, it seems were bothered by the same problem. And therefore, in still later versions of the story of the Akeda, later midrashim seek to mitigate this problem. of how could God be responsible. Also, by the way, how could Yitzchak be responsible? Yitzchak is directly responsible for killing his mother, perhaps accidentally, but shouldn't he have known better? It's just the most horrific, tragic situation. How can all this happen? Why? So our next midrash, which tries to deal with this problem, this comes from the Midrash Tanchuma. The Midrash Tanchuma is a complex midrash, which has different layers of interpretation. The earliest layers go back perhaps as far as Vayikra and Bereshit Rabbah, the earlier midrashim. But then it has various later layers, which go perhaps even to the earliest, to the beginning of the Middle Ages. So we can't know exactly when any particular part of the Tanchuma was necessarily written a lot of the time. But it does seem that this midrash, this retelling, the Tanchuma's retelling of the story of the Akeda, is aware of and is responding to the version of the retelling that we saw in Vayikra Rabbah. And how does it tell the story? Ba'oto sha'a halach Satan etzel Sarah v'nizdamen la hidmut Yitzchak. It now introduces a new character, Satan, the Satan. And it's he who now comes to Sarah, dressed up, appearing as if he's Yitzchak. So Yitzchak is removed from the scene. And what happens? Sarah asks him, my son, what did your father do to you? In this version, it sounds like Sarah already suspects something's up. That perhaps this wasn't a simple father-son outing. Amar la, Ditalani aviv v'aleni harim v'orideni b'kaot v'aleni l'rosh har echad uvana mizbeach v'sideh hamaracha v'erich et ha'etzim v'akadoti al gabe hamizbeach. Once again, he tells her the whole story, all dramatically, point by point. He took me up mountains and down valleys, took me up to the mountain, and he put me on the mizbeach, tells them all the details of the story. V'lakach et hasakin l'shachteni, and he took out this knife to kill me. And if God himself didn't come out of heaven and say, lay not a hand upon the lad, I would be dead. And he had barely finished speaking when she died. So the character that gets introduced here is Satan, the Satan. And he already is introduced to the story of the Akeda very early on in the history of its interpretation, even before Chazal. And the Satan is used in the interpretation to mitigate this problem of theodicy, of why the good suffer. And in fact, the whole figure of the Satan, not only in Judaism, but in Western monotheistic religions in general, his purpose is to deal with the problem of evil, which is really a problem for monotheistic ethical religions. Because if God is all powerful and he's all good, so why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Either he should be able to control it, and if he's good, he should control it. So this figure of the Satan says, well, there's a sort of a semi-autonomous force which is result from evil, which causes evil in the world. And God tolerates, for whatever reasons, the existence of this force. That's the concept of Satan, and it's meant to ease the problem of evil in the world and how God allows evil in the world. It doesn't really solve the problem because God still is all powerful. If Satan were truly independent, then we wouldn't be a monotheistic religion anymore. We'd be a polytheistic religion. So it doesn't solve the problem, but at least it removes God. It's a buffer between God and the evil that happens in the world. So now the Tanchuma introduces the Satan precisely for this purpose, to remove God from direct responsibility for the death of Sarah. It says, no, it was the Satan who came and dressed up as Yitzchak and told this story, it seems in the most dramatic and terrifying possible way, and that's what killed Sarah. So this is an attempt to deal with the impact of placing Sarah's death in the center of the story and say, okay, but the Satan is ultimately, he's the proximate cause of Sarah's death. But ultimately, Ultimately, this is not really such a successful response or to the problem of how could God bring such terrible death and suffering to Sarah. Because in the end, what did the Satan do? He just came and told the truth. He just reports the same story we've just read. Wouldn't Sarah have found out anyways? God still set into motion this series of events, which when the news reaches Sarah, it kills her. Why does God do this? God still has a hand in Sarah's death. And we still have to ask, how could he possibly have allowed such a terrible thing to happen? And once again, it seems that the readers of this midrash were sensitive to this problem that, okay, we've gotten Satan in here, but still, why does God let this all happen? Why does he set up such a golden opportunity for the Satan to cause problems, an event which could have happened even if the Satan didn't get involved? And this takes us to our next midrash. Our next midrash is Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, a midrash which was edited around the time, it seems, as the time Tanhuma, the latest layers of the Tanhuma, the previous midrash we saw. And once again, it seems that the authors of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer were aware of the Tanhuma midrash and sought to tweak it in order to further mitigate the problem of God's apparent responsibility for Sarah's suffering and death. Here's the way it tells the story. Once again, it retells the entire story. Ukisheshav Avraham Mehar Moria, Chara Apo Shel Samael, Shera'a Shelo Alta Biado, Tavat Libo Levatel Korbano Shel Avraham Avinu. So, as I've said, the story, Satan appears earlier in the story, in a lot of retellings of the story, and he attempts to prevent Avraham from fulfilling from doing the actual sacrifice, from going through with all of this, and he fails. And after all that happens, we come back to Samael, which is another name for the Satan, and and we get his response to Avram's great triumph of the Akeda. What does he do? He's very upset. So Me'asa, what did he do? Halach v'amar l'Sarah. So he comes to Sarah, this time in person, not imposter, not pretending to be Yitzchak, but as himself. He says to her, Halo shamat ma nasa ba'olam. You know what's going on in the world? Have you heard? Amar la. She says, no, I don't know what's going on. Amar la, lakach Avraham et Yitzchak beno, v'shachto v'hikruvo al gabeh hamizbeach le'olah. He lies to her. He doesn't tell her what happened, what we just read in the story. He claims that Avraham actually killed Sarah. Hitchila Sarah livchot umiyalelet shlosha yevavot kineged shlosha tkiyot, shlosha yevavot yalalot kineged shlosha yevavot, uparcha nishmata b'meita. Uba Avraham umatzah shemeta. So in this case, what kills Sarah is not the Akeda. If she had heard what actually happened, maybe she wouldn't have had a problem with it. She knows in the end everyone was okay, and she might have thought it was the right thing for Avraham and Yitzchak to go through with it, and in the end, everyone's okay. That's not what kills her. It has nothing to do with the Akeda. What kills her is Satan, the Satan's lies. He lies to her. It's his duplicity that kills Sarah. And therefore, God really has nothing to do with this. The events which Avraham sets into motion have nothing to do with Hashem sets into motion that Avraham and Yitzchak continue to enact, have nothing to do with Sarah's death. It's a totally separate thing. The Midrash then goes on and it repeats this notion of her cries being connected to the blows of the shofar, and it connects them not only to the tkiyot, but also to the yivavot, to the tru'ah, or the shvarim. So it repeats that, and then it gives us a whole new scene, which I don't think appears before, which is that Avraham, we actually see Avraham coming home and finding Sarah, his beloved wife, dead. After this whole great adventure, he wants to come back to his wife, his high point of Avraham's life, and he comes home and his wife is gone. He hasn't been able to say goodbye to her. She's already dead. So Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer has succeeded has succeeded in removing God's culpability for causing this terrible tragedy and suffering and death of Sarah. But at the same time, I think it also undermines what the original retelling of the story by Vayikra Rabbah has accomplished by putting Sarah at the center of the story and by making her death the climax and the ultimate result of the story. Now, the whole role of Sarah is marginalized. This whole scene up here is really an epilogue. The entire story is over. It's not a direct result of the events, but rather something that happens afterwards. Oh, and by the way, then the Satan comes and gets his little revenge, even though he's been completely defeated. So Sarah's death is no longer an integral part of the Akeda. It's something that happens, it's connected, but it happens afterwards. It's not an integral part of the Akeda. And it's a little hard here to understand exactly what it is we got God to remember when we blow the shofar. That the Satan killed her, that she cried over nothing because she thought her son was dead and wasn't. It doesn't quite follow, or it certainly isn't as powerful. So what happens is that in the Midrash's attempts to deal with the problem of how could God cause Sarah's death and to mitigate God's responsibility, they also, to a certain extent, deflate the power of the original Midrash. They deflate the power, they remove Sarah from the center of the Midrash, and its radical rereading of this female perspective and experience and response to the Akeda, that gets really softened and pushed to the side. So this Midrash pays a price in attempting to solve the problem of Sarah's suffering. It also reduces her role in the entire story. Okay. So what have we seen here? What we've seen is that the rabbis start with a single problem in the text. What does it mean, vayavo, that Abraham came to mourn Sarah? And out of that, they link two previously unconnected stories and create a larger story and ultimately find a central place for Sarah and her death in the story of the Akeda itself. And in doing so, totally transform the story of the Akeda. But then, and this happens very frequently in Midrash, a Midrash sets out to answer one problem, but then it generates another problem. And subsequent Midrashim have to come to deal with the secondary problem and retell the story further and further change the story to deal with that new problem. In this case, the problem is this problem of how God could let such a terrible thing happen to Sarah. And in the process of attempting to resolve this problem, by introducing the figure of the Satan, of Satan, into the story of her death, of Sarah's death, the later Midrashim solve the problem, but they also marginalize Sarah's place in the whole story. And that's the story of Sarah and her role in the Akeda.